Hi, my name is Isaiah Margala, and this is my TOK presentation. So, my presentation is going to be about the impact of culture on knowing through language with relation to the arts as an area of knowledge. Um, my real life situation is when I was reading a book. It's called an ethnography, which is a scientific description about or a scientific account of another culture. I was reading this book about the Tongan people, which is a country in Southeast Asia, and there were words in the book. Most of the book was in English, but there were some words that weren't translated, and um, it brought me to think like the words couldn't even be described to me. I had to instead like actually learn about the meaning of the word instead of having like a descriptive translation. And this led me to think like how I understand things differently based on the language I speak. And since the language I speak is like dictated by my culture, this led me to my knowledge question, which is to what extent does culture affect knowing through language? Um, and my ways of knowing is language, and the area of knowledge I'm going to focus on is the arts and how you can know through language within the arts. So, to connect language and the arts, I'm going to look at words with no direct translation in pieces of literary art. Um, Language is one way of knowing, but it acts as a lens through which one can view the world. This is seen in words with no direct translation. One example is coup d'état, which is a French word, but there's no English translation, and it means sort of like a violent overthrow of an existing government to like put in a new government. And there's no direct translation for this word to English. So it changes the way someone would think about this word or the concept based on whether or not they're speaking French or English. Um, this relates back to my knowledge question because the language you speak is a result of the culture you're raised in. So, growing up in France, a child probably grows up speaking French, but in the United States, most children grow up speaking English. And this changes the way they would think about the concept of a coup. One more example is a peck, or the word peck in English doesn't have a direct translation to French, but instead has to be described as attack with the front of a beak. And this just changes like how you would think about a bird pecking or that in different situations. Um, this is also seen in the arts as an area of knowledge. Works of literary art are created in like across the world in all different countries, and each of these countries and locations have different cultures, and different cultures often have different languages. So when reading literature from across the world, a lot of times it's translated from the native language into the language someone's reading it in, usually English. Um, and this can be seen in a lot of works, but I'm going to focus in on three: Candide, ethnographies, and the Bible. Candide was originally written in French, but it was later translated into a lot of other languages. But this means that like some of the phrases or like tone in the book don't accurately represent like the intentions of the author when writing. And there's also the idea of translation bias, which is like the concept that the translator's perspective of a work is embedded into his translation of it, and that you can't really understand the full meaning because you're reading through a translator. Um, Another place where language change how we know is ethnographies, which are as I said before, scientific accounts of different cultures. So the one I read was a book called Voyages by Kathy Small, and it was about a poor country named Tonga in Southeast Asia. And in the book, there were a lot of native phrases. Most of them were like family words or like occupational words. Um, and none of them had a direct translation to an English word. And when, like, instead of being described, I actually had to learn what the word meant because having the word be described each time it was written down in the ethnography, it took away from the meaning and like the value of the ethnography itself. But after learning the words in Tongan to read this book, I actually had an understanding of the culture. And it was different than before when I had the phrases like only described to me by the author. Um, a final piece where the meaning is changed based on language is the Bible. Um, there have been hundreds of translations of the Bible since it was written, and with this many translations, there has to be variations across each translation in meaning and like diction, syntax, everything. Um, the original books were written mostly in Greek, and this is actually an interesting part of how it was translated because back when it was written in Greek, Greek didn't use much punctuation, especially periods. They would mostly use like colons and semicolons, or the English equivalent of colons and semicolons. But that totally, like when it was translated to English, it totally changes the meaning because the translator has to put meaning into it or put punctuation into it, and that can change. So that changes the phraseology and the punctuation of the original writing. And these two things, phraseology and punctuation, are super important to understanding the tone and the overall message of what they're writing. So with different punctuation, the information and knowledge like interpreted and like gained from reading this book is going to be super different. So now I'm going to move on to my conclusion and implications. So in conclusion, by looking at Candide, the Bible, and everything, I found that culture influences the way we know to a great extent. Um, the culture you're raised in changes, or the language you speak is a result of the culture you're raised in, and the language you speak um, influences how you know certain things. And one area of knowledge that is evident in is the arts, as we've seen. And the knowledge one gains from reading a work of art in the original language may be different than the knowledge you gain by reading a translation. And this can be because of words with no direct translation or like a translation bias or changes in tone because of the punctuation. Um, and because of this, culture affects the way we know through language to a great extent, especially within the arts. Because culture dictates language and language changes how we know. And one implication of this is that knowledge may be partially limited to the culture it was produced in. And what I mean by this is that knowledge is produced in a certain country. Um, and this country has a different language than the other countries. And knowledge that is produced or recorded in a different language, you might not be able to truly understand that knowledge from a different culture. And this relates to real life and the production and communication of knowledge across culture.